Armitage takes an unexpected view of poverty in his poem To Poverty. Most of us, especially as we grow older, seek to escape poverty as much as we can. If you've ever been poor, you'll know exactly what I mean. But in Armitage's poem, he appears to welcome poverty as a companion to the poet, a necessary companion. The first clue to this is in the title. Laycock was a poet in Yorkshire and Lancashire who was born in the same village that Armitage was born in, Marsden in Yorkshire, and I'll deal with that later at the end of the video. But at the beginning of this poem, Armitage wants to show that this poem is about poetry itself and the relationship between being poor and actually being a brilliant poet. He begins with a personification, in fact a dramatization of poverty, by creating it as a person. And he notices that poverty is back, and actually poverty has been here for quite a while. In other words, his poverty has fueled his poetry for a long time. Instead of trying to escape this poverty, he is now welcoming it. Pull up a chair, he says. There's something humorous about this, and that's echoed by the rhyming couplet at the beginning of this verse. The poem is written in a series of verses in the form of an ode. However, poverty becomes a sinister figure. It is a shadow, a silhouette, without a face and a shape. The alliteration, the sibilance of the S sounds, makes it sound a sinister presence, despite his jokey welcoming of it. He makes another joke as though he's joined to poverty like a Siamese twin, and the simile focuses on the fact that they're joined at the pocket. In other words, his pocket is empty, there's no room for anything else, it's joined to poverty. There's no money in it. There is a sense that he could have escaped poverty somehow. This appears in metaphor here. I should have split and cut loose while poverty had the flu. But if this is an autobiographical poem, then he had an opportunity to make some money, but chose instead not to. I let you pass the buck, the bug, bad blood. This seems a rather strange description of his choosing to write poems instead and remain poor. The alliteration of buck and bug and bad blood are plosive sounds and quite aggressive. It's as though he's angry with himself. He let poverty pass the buck, in other words, get rid of the money. It's as though he's been weak in allowing poverty to get the better of him. But by the end of this verse, he's realised that actually poverty should be welcome. Come closer, he says, to the light, and that's symbolic of seeing more properly. In other words, his poem is more truthful because of the poverty he feels. And let me make you out. You get a sense of the poem being a way of thinking through the effects of poverty on his life and on his poetry. We're beginning to ask the question, is poverty necessary to focus the mind of the poet? And so poetry itself makes a fruitful relationship with poverty. Let me count the ways that you have hurt me. This isn't just a complaint. The ways that he's counting are measured in poems. It's the poems that are his way of counting. This is a reference to Elizabeth Barrett Browning and her famous poem, which includes the line, "How do I love thee? Let me count the ways." And because this is a poem about poetry, Armitage would expect us to know this. And so there is a deal of humour when he changes love to hurt, but beneath that he's also reminding us that beneath that hurt is love. He loves what poetry he's producing, and he owes that to poverty. In other words, there's a love for the poverty he's feeling and experiencing. Consequently, as his poverty has increased, so has his wordplay. This is reflected in the alliteration, damp and dark and down and the D in and then this idea of the repetition, the rhythm of the and the and the. The rhythm of these two lines is driven by the fact that each word is one syllable. When you left me in the damp, the dark, the red, or down and out, or out of work, the weeks on end, you can see the grand building up of passion and anger, but also a sense of joy in the way the words fit together with their rhythm. And then the repetition of the rhythm of bread without butter, bed without supper, and the half rhyme between supper and butter. It's joyful in its wordplay as well as resentful in its emotion. Again, showing his mixed feelings about the necessary relationship the poet has with poverty. This verse feels slightly odd. We're not sure whether this incident, where he's broken both his legs by falling through a shed, is something that has actually happened to Armitage, or happened to Laycock, or whether the speaker is in fact a made-up character, and this is an event that happened in their lives. They've been laid up for 13 weeks, and that seems a convenient figure, the number 13 being unlucky, which suggests that it probably isn't true, and also the fact that he needed splints for his legs, but the only way to have these made was to have sticks of furniture broken. This obviously wouldn't happen in the 20th century, but could have happened to Laycock in the 1860s. This feels like an interruption in the poem, and to reflect that, there's been a change. So each other verse has had a rhyming couplet here, but shed and legs isn't really even a half rhyme, although split and splint is, and set and wait is nearly one. This verse is again quite playful. He imagines all the other places poverty could go and all the people it could visit. He picks on the Queen because she's the richest person in the country and therefore is most able to resist poverty. Lean on the doctor, lean on, and the dean, and the internal rhyme of lean and dean becomes playful. Breathe on the major, the mason, the manager. You can see the alliteration building up again playfully. He's excited with the possibilities of language here, even as he's trying to dismiss poverty. And then there's this little joke, find a novelist at least. We get the sense that a novelist can earn their money much more easily than the poet, something that's bitterly true for most poets who might sell only a couple of hundred copies of a poetry anthology, whereas novels will sell in their thousands. And then the rhythm of this line, to bother with, to bleed, to leech. The assonance of the double E sounds here sound quite pleading, and so the playfulness has stopped, and he's actually desperate to get rid of poverty again. But everything changes in this final verse. You can see that it suddenly has more lines in it, and the couplet that should be here at the beginning has now moved to the bottom. There's a sense of completeness and finality here. He's finally made up his mind. And what has he decided? On second thoughts, stay put. He needs his poverty to stay because it's his creative muse. He wants to stab poverty in the back. In other words, his poems are going to attack poverty. Ultimately, perhaps he thinks he might make financial gain out of poetry, but more importantly, the poems themselves stop him being poor. And just to emphasise that, he takes America's probably most famous poet, Robert Frost, and claims that Robert Frost has given him this idea. Then we find that the emotional impact of being poor, I'd rather keep you in the corner of my eye than wait for you, suggests that the feeling of waiting to lose everything you've got is much worse than having very little and not much to lose. And so he'd rather be poor than just out of poverty, waiting to dip into it again. Then the final line ends with an invitation, sit down, and then with a command, I said, sit down, as though he's trying to own poverty and overcome it. And in many ways, this poem has done exactly that. He's overcome his poverty by turning even the worst predicaments into a successful poem. Okay, the next bits of this video are biographical details which will help with an A-star analysis, although in the OCR exam you wouldn't need any of this information, but having said that, it will help. So here is some details about Samuel Laycock, and what's interesting about him is that he's born in Marsden, the same village in Yorkshire as Armitage was, but that he moved across the border to Lancashire, and like most Yorkshiremen, Armitage makes a lot of the rivalry between Yorkshire and Lancashire, and so in some ways Samuel Laycock has betrayed his roots, gone over to the other side. This might remind you of Armitage's poem True North, in that sense that he betrayed his roots when he went off to become a student, and then gradually came back to his roots again. Perhaps in an effort to earn money, Armitage has written a very good kind of autobiography called All Points North, and this is just an extract that I've taken from what's freely available on Kindle. We can learn a little about Laycock. There is perhaps a slight sense of envy because Laycock, even though only selling poems in the north, sold thousands of copies of his poems. More than most poets managed to shift throughout the whole country in a lifetime, and no doubt that's something that is at the forefront of Armitage's mind. He's quite jokey about the fact that Laycock's reputation is in his way. It makes Laycock somebody to move past or knock over. And interestingly, the poem we've just read doesn't really seek to knock Laycock over, although he does do this next bit to it. The best way to get at him is to take his poems and translate them from whatever version of English he wrote in to whatever version of English you practice yourself. And there's a sense of Armitage really practicing with words, playing around with alliteration, with rhythm. All the lines were virtually in iambic pentameter. He loves those plosive B's and D's. He loves those colloquial phrases. There is a sense of him at play, really enjoying himself, and grateful to the legacy that Marsden has given him, and that inspiration that he gave him. Despite the fact that his poems would go on to earn quite a bit of money, we'll have a look here at the beginning of one of Laycock's most famous poems, Welcome Bonny Bird. And the bonny bird is a metaphor, is actually the birth of a son, although autobiographically it was a daughter who was born at this time. Toimes are bad. That sounds more Irish, doesn't it? But that's supposed to be a Lancastrian phonetic spelling of how he pronounced. And pobbies was a food, and they were short of it, even for Joe, their other son. So we've got the sense here that the birth of a child in poverty has spawned also the birth of a poem. So through Laycock we've got this link between poverty and the desire to write poems. If you want to read more about this, visit allpoetry.com. There we are. Pobbies is bread soaked with milk. You can see that it's not a very nutritious food. And I've ended here with what both poets have in common, the pursuit of happiness in the face of poverty, and it's this pursuit which fuels his poetry. So looked at this way, the poem is actually a celebration of poverty and something that we should embrace, or at least the poet should.